Picture this. You're standing knee-deep in Polish mud, freezing your bits off in the dead of winter, thousands of miles from home. You haven't seen your family in years. And the worst part? Your enemy simply refuses to admit they've lost. That was the reality facing Napoleon's Grande Armée in January ke-1807. The man who conquered half of Europe, who'd crushed the Austrians at Austerlitz and humiliated the Prussians at Jena, was about to face something entirely unexpected. A battle so brutal, so utterly savage that even in victory everyone lost. This is the story of Eylau, the battle history tried to forget. Now, before we dive into the carnage, you need to understand just how dominant Napoleon had been up to this point. The French Emperor was basically the final boss of early 19th century Europe. He'd swept aside every army foolish enough to challenge him. His reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. But here's the thing about being on top: you can't stay there forever. And the winter 1807 was about to teach Napoleon a lesson he'd never asked for. The Grande Armée had been campaigning for months. These weren't fresh recruits eager for glory. These were battle-hardened veterans, exhausted veterans, who'd spent years away from French soil. Poland offered them nothing but frozen wasteland, empty stomachs, and an enemy commander who clearly hadn't read the script where he was supposed to roll over and surrender. That commander was General Levin August von Bennigsen. Despite having a thoroughly German name and being born in Hanover, this bloke had served the Russian Empire for 34 years. He knew a thing or two about warfare, and on the 27th of January, he decided it was high time to stop running and start fighting. With 90,000 Russians and the Prussians under his command, Bennigsen launched a winter offensive that caught the French off guard. His target, Marshal Ney's exposed 6th Corps. Bold move that, but Ney wasn't having it. He slipped away like water through fingers, whilst Bernadotte's 1st Corps put up a proper scrap at Mohrungen, buying precious time. Napoleon, being Napoleon, immediately saw an opportunity. The hunter had become the hunted. The Emperor started plotting a massive encirclement, the kind of tactical brilliance he'd become famous for. Except Bennigsen wasn't an idiot. Someone leaked Napoleon's plans, probably a captured messenger or loose-lipped officer, and the Russian general caught on just in time. What followed was 5 days of the most exhausting pursuit you can imagine. Picture thousands of soldiers marching through ice and the snow, day after day, whilst Murat's cavalry nipped at the Russian heels like persistent terriers. Prince Bagration commanded the Russian rearguard, and he was absolutely brilliant at it. The French threw everything at them, but couldn't break through. Meanwhile, up north, Ney was shadowing the Prussian corps led by Lestock, while Soat's 4th Corps followed the Russians toward a tiny East Prussian town that most people had never heard of. The town was called Eylau. On the 7th of February, things kicked off properly. Soat's troops marched up an icy road and found the Russians dug in behind fences, ditches, and the makeshift barricades. The Russian division was commanded by General Barclay de Tolly, who'd prepared a nasty welcome for any French soldiers foolish enough to attack. Just before dusk, fighting erupted around the town cemetery. Now, there's something particularly grim about battling for a graveyard, isn't there? More and more troops got sucked into the chaos. The French eventually took the cemetery with a bayonet, brutal, close quarters fighting where you can see the whites of your enemy's eyes. But the Russians weren't done. Barclay himself led a counterattack and he got himself seriously wounded by grapeshot for his troubles. The street fighting continued long after the sun went down. When the smoke cleared, 4,000 men on each side lay dead or wounded. Officers and the common soldiers alike were genuinely shocked by how vicious it had been. This wasn't the clean, decisive battle they'd expected. This was something darker. Then the temperature dropped like a stone. Many of the wounded simply froze to days where they'd fallen. Think about that for a moment. Injured, unable to move, watching the night sky as the cold slowly claims you. The French ransacked Eylau for anything that could provide warmth or sustenance. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers wrapped themselves in greatcoats and they tried to sleep in open fields. Their officers forbade fires, worried about giving away positions. It was absolutely miserable for everyone involved. That night, Napoleon's biggest concern wasn't the battle itself. He was terrified the Russians would disappear under cover of darkness, robbing him of the decisive victory he desperately craved. His entire campaign hinged on crushing the Russian army once and for all. He needn't have worried. Bennigsen was done running. Before dawn broke, Napoleon stood on the cemetery knoll with his telescope, trying to make out enemy positions through the morning gloom. What he saw made his blood run cold. 67,000 Russians were packed into two massive lines stretching across 3 miles, both flanks anchored on fortified villages, and positioned throughout their lines, 400 guns. That's an absolutely staggering amount of artillery for that era. The Russians were basically saying, "Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough." Napoleon had just 45,000 men and 137 guns. Not brilliant odds. But he wasn't overly concerned because he knew they fought as Third Corps. 15,000 fresh troops would arrive any minute in perfect position to smash into the Russian flank. Victory was inevitable. Right at dawn, whilst French troops were still getting organized, hundreds of Russian guns opened up. The bombardment was absolutely massive. Round shot crashed through buildings in Eylau, turning stone into lethal shrapnel. Men were torn apart by iron balls moving faster than sound. The French artillery answered in kind, and what followed was the largest combined artillery bombardment the world had ever witnessed. It lasted nearly 3 hours. Whilst Bennigsen had more guns, French crews were better trained, and against those densely packed Russian lines, they literally couldn't miss. Every shot found flesh. Then Default's leading divisions arrived, perfectly positioned on the Russian left flank. But before they could attack, a Russian cavalry brigade led by Prince Golitsyn charged straight at them. Default's veterans stood firm and shot the horsemen down with disciplined musket fire. But that brave, doomed charge bought precious time for General Bagofut to reorganize his defensive line. When Default finally attacked around 8 in the morning, he found the Russians entrenched on it with formidable artillery support. His lead division got absolutely mauled, suffering 1,500 casualties before being thrown back in disorder. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Napoleon watched this unfold with growing alarm. He feared the Russians might withdraw before his trap could close. This was the critical moment. He decided, time to roll the dice. He sent orders flying out to Marshal Augereau's 7th Corps and the General St. Hilaire's division. They were to launch a frontal assault. At all costs, the Russians had to be prevented from escaping. Marshal Augereau was 49 years old and he had been with Napoleon since the Italian campaign of 1796. He was a veteran of countless battles, but that morning, he was desperately ill. Nevertheless, at 10 o'clock, strapped to his horse so he wouldn't fall off, he led 12,000 troops forward. Just as heavy snow began to fall, visibility dropped to practically nothing. Augereau's divisions drifted off course in the blizzard and stumbled straight into the artillery duel between both armies. French and Russian cannonballs tore through the ranks like they were made of paper. But these were professional soldiers. They pushed on doggedly toward the Russian line. Then the blizzard suddenly lifted. One division found itself facing 70 Russian guns at a range of just 30 yards. 30 yards. You could practically reach out and detach the cannon barrels. Seconds later, canister shot obliterated their forward ranks. It was wholesale slaughter. Another French division actually broke through the Russian line but found themselves surrounded on 3 sides. They were annihilated by Russian bayonets. Augereau's horse was killed beneath him, leaving the marshal badly injured. As survivors stumbled back in blind panic, Russian cavalry and the infantry surged forward. Entire regiments were swallowed up. Order and the discipline collapsed completely. The 14th Infantry, nicknamed the Brave for their heroics at Rivoli 10 years earlier, tried to maintain formation. They were surrounded and shot to pieces, suffering 75% casualties and losing their eagle standard. In 30 minutes, the Russians inflicted 5,000 casualties on Augereau's 7th Corps. It effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. It was one of the worst battlefield disasters of the entire Napoleonic Wars. Eylau was no longer a fight for victory. It had become a desperate struggle for survival. Napoleon watched this catastrophe unfold from the cemetery knoll. He knew immediately that he had to stabilize the situation and buy time to reorganize his center. So he turned to Marshal Murat and his cavalry reserve. It was a desperate gamble. The horses were exhausted and freezing. They'd be outnumbered and unsupported by infantry. But Murat, flamboyant, apparently fearless Murat, never hesitated. He assembled 40 squadrons, 5,000 dragoons and cuirassiers, and led them forward. What followed became legendary. Unable to move faster than a walk due to the terrible conditions, Murat's cavalry nevertheless presented a formidable wall of men, horses, and steel. Grouchy's dragoons drove back the advancing Russians. Then Paul's steel-clad cuirassiers thundered forward on their massive horses. Finding a gap between two Russian divisions, they used it to pry open the enemy line. For a glorious moment, it seemed unstoppable. But as they neared Bennigsen's headquarters, a Russian battery blasted them with canister at point-blank range. Paul himself was mortally wounded. French momentum evaporated. Murat ordered his squadrons to regroup and pull back. He almost didn't make it. The Russian 4th Division had moved to block his escape route. Napoleon, seeing this, ordered Marshal Bessières to lead forward the Guard cavalry. 2,000 of the finest horsemen in Europe advanced into that swirling mess of shot and snow to cheers of Fiflempreur. When Colonel Lepic saw his men ducking from incoming fire, he shouted, "Heads up, by God! Those are bullets, not turds." The chasseurs of the Guard scattered Russian infantry, shot down gunners, and carved out a path for Murat's retreating squadrons. The losses were terrible in men and horses, but it succeeded. The Russian advance had been stopped cold. The initiative had swung back to Napoleon. By now, they thought Third Corps had arrived in sufficient force to launch a proper assault. Anticipating this, Bagofut withdrew to a new defensive line on the Kreuzberg, a dominating height perfect for artillery. 2 hours of chaotic fighting followed. Every French advance was challenged by a fierce Russian counterattack, but supported by dragoons and the St. Hilaire's division, Third Corps slowly ground down the enemy. Bennigsen was forced to commit his last reserve Kamensky's 14th Division. Supported by cavalry, they drove the French from Klein-Sausgarten and across the fields beyond until French artillery checked their advance. When Defoe resumed his attack at 3 in the afternoon, the Russian line buckled. The Kreuzberg was taken, so was Bennigsen's headquarters at Auklappen. Bennigsen scraped together enough units to improvise a new defensive line, but French guns hauled up to the Kreuzberg opened devastating fire. The French pressure was irresistible. The Russian flank would surely collapse at any moment, handing Napoleon the decisive victory he'd sought all along. All that was required was one final push. But then something unexpected happened. Early that morning, Bennigsen had sent urgent orders to Prussian General Anton von Lestock to join the main army as quickly as possible. Lestock was nearly 70 years old but still energetic as ever, assisted by his highly capable chief of staff, Colonel Gerhard von Scharnhorst. His corps 9,000 men was 8 miles northwest of Eylau, closely watched by Marshal Ney's 6th Corps, whose orders were to prevent the Prussians linking up with the Russians at all costs. But by force marching his troops along frozen, hilly country roads, Lestock managed to bypass Ney's blocking force. By early afternoon, the Prussians had reached Schmoditen. With his left flank crumbling, Bennigsen knew there was no more time to lose. At 4 o'clock, Lestock Prussians charged forward. Defoe's men had been marching and fighting for man-hours and were utterly spent. They managed a few ragged valleys before they turned and ran. Russian cavalry followed in pursuit. Defoe, with just one intact division remaining, prepared to make a stand on the Kreuzberg. "The brave," he shouted, "will find a glorious death here." Fortunately for Defoe, the enemy attacks were poorly coordinated, and his 40-gun battery inflicted terrible losses. Around 5:30, as dusk fell, Ney's corps arrived in pursuit of the Prussians and took Schmoditen. This new threat forced Bennigsen to call off his attack on Defoe. As darkness descended, the day's slaughter finally came to an end. Since crowning himself emperor in 1804, Napoleon had waged campaign after campaign, battle after battle, all ending in brilliant success. No more longer. Bennigsen, learning the true scale of his army's losses and its critical shortage of ammunition, withdrew overnight. The French were left holding a frozen, corpse-strewn battlefield, allowing Napoleon to claim victory. But in reality, Eylau had been a murderous slaughter without a winner. Marshal Ney, upon seeing the battlefield, exclaimed, "What a massacre!" and without result. Exact casualty figures remain unknown due to the chaos and the conditions, but the Russians likely lost 20,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The French, perhaps as many as 25,000. Thousands of French veterans, the victors of Ulm, Austerlitz, and Jena met their end on the snowy fields of East Prussia. Napoleon's Grande Armée would go on to achieve more victories, including crushing Bennigsen's Russians at Friedland 4 months later. But after the brutal losses of Eylau, it was never quite the same. Something had broken that couldn't be repaired. The aura of invincibility had cracked. So what can we learn from this frozen hell? That sometimes there are no more winners in war, only survivors. That courage and determination can't overcome everything. That the human cost of glory is often far too high. Eylau stands as a stark reminder that even the greatest military minds can be humbled by circumstances, Wazir, and the sheer unpredictability of battle. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most brutal battles fascinating, do me a favor and smash that like button. Subscribe if you want more forgotten stories from history that deserve to be remembered. And drop a comment below what other lesser-known battles should we cover. History is full of these incredible, tragic, and the utterly human stories. Let's keep digging them up together. Until next time, remember, behind every grand campaign and the glorious victory, there are real people freezing in polished snow, wondering if they'll ever see home again.